Okay, so this week's section is over debugging. And there's going to be a couple different things I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk about the exceptions and things like that, but I'm really going to focus on what you guys need for your final project, as this is one of the 20-point sections of your final project is this week's chapter. So when we're talking about debugging, there's a couple of things that we may want to raise. You guys have already seen exceptions pop up on your screen, right? Where something tried to work, didn't work, you get the red text, you try to figure out what's going on. Right now, you guys have been dealing with that in try and accept statements. So to try to do something, if it doesn't work, accept on that. And you can accept on specific types of errors that would come back. When you're writing your own code, it may be beneficial for you to actually raise your own error message. So if something isn't happening the way you would expect it to, you can raise your own error message instead of something like none type or the wrong data type or this or that, or trying to print a integer instead of a string and you get those messages on there, can't concatenate. You can raise your own error messages in your program. You do this with the raise command. You use the raise keyword. You're going to be a call out to the exception function, and then you want some kind of string with some helpful error message to pass to the program. So an example is going to be raise exception, and then you put in whatever you want your error message to be inside of here. And then at that point in your text, you're going to get this traceback raise exception inside of there. So again, this is a way for you to create your own exceptions inside of there. You can also do these inside try and accept statements and kind of work those through here. You can also do accepts. So for example, if you look at this one here, we try to print something out. And if that does not work, we do exception as which in this case, is just going to be a variable name. And that allows us to print out whatever that error is in a way that we want it formatted. So you may see this in some other people's code as exception as E or exception as You can call this last part whatever you want. It's just a variable name so that you can pass it into a print statement and print it out the way you want it. Anybody have any questions on raising exceptions, things like that? Okay. Instead of dumping that text to the screen, which is what we've been talking about, and you get traceback errors like this, we can also raise this exception inside of a function, and that way we get it back as a string that we can then print it out or save it. We can write it out to a text file, etc. If we want to do that. So for example, here we can import traceback. We try to raise an exception. If that doesn't work, then we can set up an error file, write to it, similar to what you guys just learned last week. And then you can write the format.exec version, which is just saying we're going to write back that error that you would normally get on the screen. Looks like this here. We're going to write that to a file as opposed to writing that to a screen. Then on the screen, we just say traceback info was saved to error info.txt. All right. Anybody have any questions on that? You will not need to do this part for your final, but for those of you that are very deep in Python and trying to go really next level with it, this is something that you would do. You would write your own errors in your own code so that you could accept and give yourself some feedback. Okay. The next section here is going to talk about assertions. An assertion is basically a sanity check to make sure your code isn't doing something obviously wrong. Those sanity checks are performed by the assert statement, and if that sanity check fails, then an assertion error is going to be raised as an exception. So to do this, we assert keyword. We have any kind of condition, which will evaluate to true, false. Think of it a lot like a if statement almost. So we assert on a condition, we put a comma after it, and then a string to display if that condition turns out false. So for example, if we say ages, and then we give it a list of ages, we run .sort so that we have all the ages in the appropriate order. And if we run assert that ages 0, and in this case 15, is less than or equal to the last number over here, then we know our sort is correct, right? We're basically checking to make sure that the lowest number is in the front spot and that it's lower than the last one in our list. If that evaluates to true, this assert statement does nothing. However, if for whatever reason that was false, for example, if we say reverse, where we force it to be incorrect, then at that point, we're going to get an assertion error. in which case we can assign what we want that assertion error to be. So it's a way for you to write little checks in your code to make sure that you are getting what you would assume that you would be getting by running a sort. Again, not something I'm specifically asking for you to do on your final project, but I do want to make sure we introduce that to you. Does anybody have any questions on assertions? Okay, this next part is what is going to be required for your final project. So right now, I'm sure everybody's been taking print statements and printing things out so you can see what's going on behind your program, right? You print out a variable, you print out everything just so you can see what's going on. But as you know, as you print those out, it's harder to go back and remember to remove all those print statements that you don't want, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to use logging, and logging is a way for us to debug our code to where it goes out to a separate file and we can turn it off and on. That way we don't have to go back and change all of those print statements before we actually submit our code to somebody, in this case, me in the final project. To do this, we import logging up at the top of our program, and we have to set up the basic configuration for logging. So if you copy and paste this into a file, if I just pull up a new idle, let's go to a new file. And then I copy and paste this directly out of here into the top of my file. You'll notice that when you copy and paste from the website, it's actually broken. You'll need to backspace here so that it's in the right format. You can also go up here to format and hit enter, and that way it kind of aligns things. Then what that's going to do in this basic configuration is set the logging level to debug, and we'll talk about the different logging levels. And then the format that we want to print our logging statement is this here, which basically is going to print the time, the logging level, and whatever message we want it to print. To do a logging statement at this point, all I have to do is say logging.debug, and I treat it just like a print statement. So I can say this is my first debug message. And then we can go ahead and run this. And you'll see on the screen, we'll get this nice little red message that will tell us our debug stuff. So these are useful so that you can say, okay, say I had some variable out there, I could print that variable just like I would normally print it. So if I would say import random, right? And then I say random dot rand int, and I need a number to go between 1 and 10. We're going to say this is my number, right? Oops, if I can spell number correct. If we do this and then we're using this in our code, it would be nice to know what random number was selected. So we could just put something like that in here, use a simple if statement and say the random number generated was, and then we can place in our number. Okay. Then if we run this, we'll see that the random number generated was 8. So it's a great way of printing out and debugging your stuff without having to print it to the screen. Now, right now we are printing it to the screen, but what's nice is we also get a date timestamp up here. So as your program is executing, we can actually see how long it took to go from this debug section to the next debug section and print all this information out. When we talk about debugs, there's multiple ways to do debugging statements. Again, you don't use a print statement, but you can use a logging dot statement however you want. You can also use a logging dot disable here, and you can disable the level that you want to debug. Don't worry about that. What you do need to worry about, particularly for this quiz as well as the project, is there's 5 different levels of debugging or logging that's out there. You have logging.debug. This is the lowest level. It always throws people off because this chart is the other way around. Logging.debug is lowest level, which means you're going to get everything coming out of the logging errors, right? So you will get all of the logging.info, you'll get warning, you'll get error, and you'll get critical. All of that's going to show up if you set your logging debug level to debug. From there on out, they increment. The idea behind debug is that this should be used for the most minute details. In other words, finding out what the random number that was randomly generated, you should print that out. If you remember, I had you guys comment everything on your midterm projects, every single function, everything in between. The reason I had you do that is now you can copy those comment statements to logging.debug statements, so that when your function starts and you could say, this is my function for calculating blah, 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 copy that into a logging.debug statement, so that as you're reading the logs that go through, you can figure out where you're at in your program. Makes it a whole lot easier to troubleshoot. And I was working with some students that were trying to print things out to the screen, and it kind of messes up their program and such. Use a logging section in order to do that for you. Makes things a whole lot easier. Info is generated for things that are general events in your program. Warnings indicate that there's a potential problem, but it doesn't prevent the program from working or running, but it may do so in the future. An error means that an error in the program has occurred and it's failed to do something. Logging.critical is the highest level. This means that it's going to indicate a fatal error that's about to cause your program to stop and crash. Okay. In your projects, I require that you have a logging.debug and I require that you have a logging.critical. The part where everybody struggles is the logging.critical. You should only use this when your project's going to crash. Well, what if you wrote really good code and your project's not going to crash? What you have to do is make sure that there's a spot in your code in your project that would cause it to crash. This is pretty easy to do. Most of you are to the point now where you guys are separating out files, right? Everybody's kind of at least got 2 Python files. They got all the dictionaries and all the stuff in the one because it's easier to read and easier to follow along. Or maybe they moved all of your functions over to a second Python file and you're importing those in. So sometimes in your project, you have these import statements at the top and you're either working with a third-party API. So say I'm importing something to work with Discord or something like that. Or maybe I'm importing from my second file that has all my dictionaries and files in it. Right now, everybody's just importing that in. So say I had a secondary Python file called my file. You would import my file, right? Well, what if my file didn't exist? The program's going to crash. So what we want to do is put this inside of a try statement and try to import my file. And if it doesn't work, then we want to print out to the user that that file is missing. So we would say my file.py is missing. Program will now exit. Then we need to log that to our logging file. So we would use a logging.critical here and say this exact same thing so that it goes out to the error log. And then we want to use a sys.exit here in order to end the program right then and there. If that file doesn't work, the rest of our project's not going to work. So we need to make sure we import sys, and then we'll use sys.exit. So essentially, every import statement needs to be wrapped inside of a try and accept, and use a logging.critical here to do it. Up here where we imported our file, this would be a great spot for us to do a logging.debug and simply tell our program, my file loaded successfully. Something like that. We don't need to print that to the user, but we can at least put it in our log file that something loaded successfully. Then throughout our project, we should be using a combination of debug statements where appropriate. You can also use any of these other levels as you see appropriate. But the only 2 that I require for the mid or the final project is going to be a debug and a critical. I encourage you to use the other ones if they make sense to use those instead.
Question.
Yes.
If something that's gonna, my project, it just prints a bunch of bullshit to the file log that you can't really sort through. Can we just use one of the other ones and not use debug?
Yeah, I mean, use debug where you want the lowest level stuff to go out to the screen. Otherwise, set it to one of the other levels. But you remember that it doesn't matter what level you set it to. If your file is set to debug, you're going to get everything. So when you print out debugs, you're going to get criticals, warnings, infos, and errors. You're going to get everything out to the screen. Okay. So you'll import that in. You can also disable it. Now, when you guys import it into your file, I don't want you to copy and paste this one that we showed you up here above where it said import logging module. Don't do this one. What I want you to do is this one down here that says writing to a file or logging to a file. We want to use this one in our project. The difference is right now it's just printing it out to the screen. This is going to detract away from your project. It would be better if this was going to another file so that we could then just go look at the file if we want to see the error message. So at the top of your project, you copy this in. Remember, you can't just copy it in. You have to fix the formatting because you're copying from the website. The big difference is here is you're now setting file name equals and then whatever you want to set. You can change this my program log.txt to whatever you want. So you can say this is my log or my logging file. You can call it whatever you want. If I run this, note that nothing happens other than now it says my logging file or my file.py is missing. The program will now exit. If I go to the folder that I executed my project in, I will see a my logging file.txt and we'll see that that is now stored in there. Notice that we didn't get the critical error message here. We got the nice clean message that said, hey, this file is missing. We're going to exit. The actual crash is now contained inside of a login file. And if you guys have ever worked with programs before, customer support, something like that, they always ask you for your log files, right? This is what your project is now generating. It's generating a log file. So you may want something at the very start of your program with the logging.debug saying this is the start of my program. And this is just going to hit you in the log message so that when we run that, we know we're starting at the beginning of the program. Then as you continue through your project, you can have it spit out all the logging errors that you feel that are necessary. The easiest way to get the requirement for the final is to do this with any files that you import. Just wrap them in try and accept statements. You have your logging.debug. You have your logging.critical. You have the points, right? But I encourage you to use debugs and other ones down inside your project. So again, this is 1/5 of your final grade is doing this. Importing this in at the top, making sure you wrap all your try and accept statements in this particular fashion. I don't know how else to make it very, very clear. This is 20 points of your final project is just doing this. All right. When I execute the program over and over, my logging file is going to just continue going, meaning that as long as there's a log file, it's just going to append to that text file. So you can delete that file. When you submit it to me, I encourage you to delete your logging file, because when I run your project, I will go back and look at your logging file and make sure things are working. It's also handy that if you happen to have a text editor like Notepad++ or a couple others, you can actually tail that file, which means that you can watch the log file in real time as your program is executing, and you can watch the errors happen as the program's executing. It's a little more advanced. It's easier just for you now just to go back and look at the text file and see what happens. Does anybody have any questions over the debugging side and what we're looking for the final? For your quiz and such, understand these levels. So if I am at level logging.warning, which logging levels are going to get recorded? Nope. Correct. You're going to get warning, error, and critical. If we were at logging level warning, I'm going to get, and this is the level that I'm talking about is in this file, right? When I set up my import, I say my level is logging.debug. If I was to set this to warning, then I would only get error messages from warnings, errors, and criticals because it's everything higher. So normally your project should be set to warning so that you catch all these other ones higher than that, but you don't want to fill up your log file with a bunch of debug stuff. in the terms of your final project, I do want you to set it to debug. I want to see everything coming out of it. But in a normal project, if you were doing this in real life, you would probably just set it to warning or even error so that you only get those type of errors in your log. Now, if you're debugging and have issues with your project, then you can go back and set your debug level to the lowest, which is debug, so that you catch everything. Yes.
If you wanted to just sort the just warning stuff, is there a way of doing that?
No. No, you're always going to get the higher level up above.
Now, is there a way of
You could filter your log file later on.
yeah, I was wondering if this chapter covers any of
Not of the text message and the
yeah, to make it look prettier, so you don't have just so much random.
would you, in your case, you would just want to adjust it. Don't use so many logging debug files, right? Set the stuff that's debug to debug. Set anything else you want to export as to say warning or info, and then set your logging level higher so that you don't get all of the debug stuff in there. Then again, all you have to do is change this level at the top where it says level.logging. By default, it's going to be set to debug so that you get everything in your logging file. If you adjust that, you can set that to whatever you want and only get that level and higher. You can also change this format. You may not want it to print the time and the level and the message like that. You may want it to print something else. So you can adjust this format however you want. Now, in the really advanced things, you can set up a thing called a logger, which will then allow you to bounce between multiple files and do a bunch of things. That is more of an advanced Python topic, so I'm not going to worry about it too much in this class. Just know that if you're going to do logging and say you have 2 Python files and you want to do logging in each one, you have to copy and paste this into the top of each file so that it will actually go ahead and add it to the log file accordingly. But this will dramatically help you troubleshoot your program. As it's starting to get bigger, instead of using a print statement, you can now just copy and paste that as a logging.debug statement. You're treating everything the same. So if you had a fancy print statement before, you're just taking out the word print and putting in a logging.debug. It's that simple. If you were using it for troubleshooting in the past. Now, usually people have questions on debugging. So does anybody have any questions on this side? I encourage you, even in this case here, I know that we recorded that this semester, go back and watch some of the old videos on debugging. That will be beneficial to you if you're not quite understanding debugging and how it works. There's some other videos that I have from previous semesters. Again, this is one of those topics that sometimes people need it presented more than one way. And that's the reason I keep those out there. Anybody here or online have questions?